It was a quiet autumn evening in Maplewood, a small town where time seemed to move a little slower, as if respecting the grief that had settled over the Thompson family's home. The loss of a loved one had cast a long shadow over their lives, turning once joyful traditions into hollow rituals. The family, Laura, her husband Mark, and their 10-year-old daughter Emily had been struggling to find their way back to normal after the passing of Laura's mother, the matriarch who had been the glue holding them together. Laura sat by the window, the amber light of the setting sun brushing against her face as she absently traced circles on her coffee mug. In the corner of the room, Mark was flipping through channels, his movements mechanical, while Emily sat on the carpet with her crayons, sketching something in silence. They were together in the same room, yet it felt as if they were miles apart, each lost in their own sadness. But then something unexpected happened, a sound that would shift the course of their lives forever. A faint whimper echoed through the backyard, just loud enough to pull Laura's attention away from the mug in her hands. She frowned, unsure if she had imagined it. The sound came again, this time a little louder. Emily looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice breaking the silence for the first time in what felt like hours. Mark muted the TV and turned toward her. They listened closely, their ears straining against the quiet. And then they all heard it, a soft, desperate cry that seemed to carry with it a plea for help. Emily bolted to her feet, her curiosity overtaking any sense of fear. "It's coming from outside," she exclaimed, running toward the back door. Laura called after her, but there was a spark in Emily's voice, a spark they hadn't seen in weeks. Mark grabbed a flashlight and followed them out into the crisp evening air. The backyard was bathed in a dim, golden glow from the porch light. The whimpering grew louder as they stepped onto the lawn, leading them toward the old wooden shed at the far end of the yard. Emily pointed to a small, shivering figure nestled near the base of the shed. "It's a puppy!" she cried, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and concern. Sure enough, there he was, a tiny, scruffy golden-brown puppy, his fur matted and damp. His big, pleading eyes locked onto theirs, and he let out another weak cry as if begging them not to leave him alone. He was trembling, his small body looking far too fragile to have been out in the cold for long. Emily crouched down, holding out her hand. The puppy hesitated, then took a cautious step toward her before collapsing into her arms. Laura and Mark exchanged a glance, their unspoken worries about responsibility and timing flickering between them. But in that moment, as they watched Emily cradle the tiny creature and whisper soothing words, something began to shift. There was a glimmer of life in their daughter's eyes, a spark of hope that had been absent since the funeral. They brought the puppy inside, wrapping him in a warm blanket. Emily named him Buddy almost immediately, a name that seemed to fit the little dog's earnest, trusting demeanor. As Laura watched Emily feed Buddy small pieces of bread and Mark gently dried him with a towel, she felt something stir in her chest, of warmth she hadn't felt in months. But the arrival of Buddy wasn't just a sweet distraction. As the days went on, it became clear that this little dog had a purpose far greater than they could have imagined. Buddy had a way of bringing light into the darkest corners of their lives, pulling laughter out of places that had forgotten how to feel joy. What they didn't realize, however, was that Buddy's journey into their lives wasn't entirely accidental. There was something almost uncanny about the timing of his appearance, something they would come to understand only later. Because Buddy wasn't just a stray looking for a home, he was a healer, a guide, and perhaps even a messenger of something greater. The bond between Buddy and the Thompsons grew quickly, but the questions surrounding his mysterious arrival lingered. Who had left him in their yard? How had he survived alone? And why did it feel like he had been sent to them at the exact moment they needed him most? What happened next would change everything. Buddy quickly became the heart of the Thompson household, his infectious energy a much-needed balm for their grief. Mornings now started with his eager barks, a call for Emily to race him around the backyard before school. Evenings were filled with his playful antics, chasing his tail or pouncing on shadows. The sadness that had weighed so heavily on Laura, Mark, and Emily began to lift, replaced by a warmth they hadn't felt in months. Buddy was more than just a pet, he was family. But as the days turned into weeks, Laura began to notice something unusual about Buddy. It wasn't just his uncanny ability to sense their emotions, how he would rest his head on Mark's lap when he seemed especially distant, or nudge Emily out of her room on days she wanted to stay curled up under her blankets. It was more than that. He had a strange way of appearing at just the right time, almost as if he knew when he was most needed. Laura brushed it off as coincidence, but the thought lingered in the back of her mind. One rainy evening, as the family sat together watching an old movie, Buddy began to grow restless. His ears perked up, and he darted to the window, letting out a low, uneasy whine. Laura exchanged a puzzled glance with Mark. "What's gotten into him?" she asked, standing to peer outside. The rain lashed against the glass, and the wind howled through the trees, but the yard was empty. Buddy's whine grew more insistent. He scratched at the door, his small body trembling with urgency. "Maybe he needs to go out," Mark suggested, grabbing a jacket. But when he opened the door, Buddy bolted into the darkness, barking furiously. Emily ran after him, calling his name, and Laura's heart raced as she grabbed an umbrella and followed. They found Buddy near the edge of the woods that bordered their yard, barking at something half hidden in the shadows. Laura hesitated, the beam of Mark's flashlight slicing through the rain. And then they saw it, a bundle, soaked and crumpled, lying at the base of a tree. Mark knelt down, his hands trembling as he carefully unwrapped the sodden cloth. Inside was a notebook, the pages warped from the rain. But what caught Laura's attention was what was tucked alongside it, a locket. She gasped, recognizing the intricate design immediately. It had belonged to her mother. "How did this get here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Emily clung to Buddy, her wide eyes reflecting the flashlight's glow. "Did Grandma leave it here before she?" Her question hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with meaning. Mark shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. This was buried with her." The words sent a shiver down Laura's spine. She reached for the notebook, her hands trembling as she opened it. The first few pages were illegible, the ink smeared from the rain. But deeper inside, where the water hadn't reached, there were entries written in her mother's neat, familiar handwriting. The first word she could make out sent chills through her. "If you're reading this, it means you've found him. Protect him. He's more important than you realize." Laura's breath caught. She flipped through the pages, scanning hurriedly. The entries were fragmented, as if her mother had written them in haste, but a recurring theme began to emerge. She wrote about a dog, a loyal companion, a guardian of sorts, who would appear in times of great need. She called him a gift, a guide, sent to those who were lost. Laura looked at Buddy, who sat quietly now, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he understood everything. "This can't be real," she muttered, her mind spinning. But the locket, the notebook, none of it made sense. The discovery sparked something in Laura, a compulsion she couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, she became consumed by the notebook's cryptic passages, piecing together her mother's words like a puzzle. The entries hinted at an event, something significant that had yet to happen. Buddy, it seemed, wasn't just there to heal them, he was there for a purpose. But what that purpose was remained unclear. One night, as the rest of the family slept, Laura sat in the living room with the notebook spread across the coffee table. Buddy lay at her feet, his steady breathing the only sound in the house. She traced her finger over one passage that stood out. "When the storm comes, he will know. Trust him. Follow him." The words unsettled her, their vagueness gnawing at her. She glanced at Buddy, who suddenly raised his head, his ears twitching. Then, without warning, he stood and padded toward the door. Laura's heart raced. "Buddy?" she whispered, but he didn't turn back. He barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that sent a chill through her. Laura hesitated, the notebook still clutched in her hand. Something told her this wasn't just a late-night whim. Grabbing a jacket, she followed him outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. Buddy led her to the edge of the woods again, but this time, he didn't stop. He pushed forward, his small form disappearing into the darkness. Laura hesitated, fear tightening her chest, but the pull to follow him was stronger. She stepped into the shadows, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet the only sound. As she moved deeper into the woods, a sense of unease settled over her. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches casting eerie shapes in the moonlight. Buddy's bark rang out ahead, guiding her. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. And then she saw it, a clearing bathed in an otherworldly glow. In the center stood an old stone marker, its surface weathered and covered in moss. Buddy sat beside it, his eyes fixed on her as if urging her forward. Laura approached slowly, her heart pounding. Etched into the stone was a symbol she didn't recognize, but beneath it was a single word: guardian. The air felt charged, almost electric, as if the clearing held a power she couldn't explain. Buddy let out a soft whine, nudging her hand with his nose. Laura knelt down, tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't say why. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The answer, it seemed, was just beginning to reveal itself. Laura knelt in the clearing, her fingers brushing the rough, moss-covered surface of the stone marker. Buddy sat close, his steady gaze on her, as if waiting for her to understand something that still eluded her. The word guardian etched into the stone sent a shiver through her, but the symbol above it, an intricate design of interlocking loops, seemed to pull at something deep inside her, something buried in memory. As the wind rustled through the trees, a faint hum filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, almost like a heartbeat. Laura looked around, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to locate its source. Buddy stood, his posture tense, his ears swiveling toward the sound. Then, without warning, he barked, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed in the stillness. Before Laura could react, the ground beneath her shifted. She stumbled back, her heart racing as the stone marker began to glow faintly. The hum grew louder, resonating through her chest. Buddy stayed rooted in place, his eyes locked on the marker, as though he'd seen this before. Laura's mind raced, 100 questions swirling in her head, but the one that screamed the loudest was why now? The glow from the marker intensified, illuminating the clearing in an ethereal light. Laura shielded her eyes, barely able to make out the symbol on the stone. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light dimmed, and the clearing was plunged back into the soft silver glow of moonlight. But something had changed. At the base of the marker, where there had been nothing but moss and dirt moments before, lay another object, something small and metallic, reflecting the faint moonlight. Laura hesitated, glancing at Buddy, who gave a low, encouraging whine. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she picked up the object. It was a key. The weight of the key in her hand felt almost too much to bear, as though it carried the burden of something far greater than its size suggested. Its design matched the loops on the marker, intricate and ancient. Laura turned it over in her hands, her heart pounding. What was it for? And why had Buddy led her here to find it? Buddy nudged her leg, drawing her attention back to him. His tail wagged slightly, but his expression was serious, almost expectant. He barked again and then took off, his small form darting back into the woods. Buddy, wait! Laura called, clutching the key as she scrambled to her feet. She followed him, her feet slipping on the damp earth as she stumbled through the undergrowth. The key's cold weight in her hand was a constant reminder that this was more than just a wild chase. Buddy led her to a part of the woods she hadn't ventured into before, where the trees grew thicker and the air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, they reached a clearing, smaller than the first but no less strange. In the center stood an old, weathered chest, its surface covered in moss and vines. It looked as though it had been there for centuries, untouched by time. Buddy stopped and turned to her, his eyes urging her forward. Laura hesitated, her fingers tightening around the key. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, doubts, and fears. But something stronger, a deep, unshakable intuition pushed her forward. She knelt before the chest, brushing away the vines to reveal a keyhole that matched the one in her hand perfectly. With a deep breath, she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, the sound reverberating through the stillness like a thunderclap. The lid creaked as she lifted it, revealing what lay inside. At first, she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. The chest was filled with photographs, letters, and small trinkets, things that looked eerily familiar. Laura reached for the topmost photo, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the faces staring back at her. It was her family, her mother, her father, and herself as a young girl. The photo was worn, the edges curling with age, but the memories it stirred were vivid. She sifted through the contents, her hands trembling. Each item told a story, not just of her mother but of their family's history, their struggles, their triumphs. And then she found it, a letter addressed to her in her mother's handwriting. Her heart pounded as she unfolded it, the words blurring through her tears. My dearest Laura, if you're reading this, it means Buddy has found you. He is more than a companion, he is your guide, your protector. I knew he would come to you when the time was right, when you needed him most. The things in this chest are reminders of where we come from, but they are also keys to understanding who you are and the strength you carry. Trust Buddy. He will show you the way, just as he showed me. Laura's hands shook as she clutched the letter to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, a mix of sorrow and gratitude washing over her. She looked at Buddy, who sat quietly beside her, his eyes full of wisdom and kindness. He had been sent to her, just as her mother had written. But why? And what was he meant to guide her toward? Before she could dwell on it, Buddy stood and barked sharply, drawing her attention. She turned to see Mark and Emily emerging from the woods, their faces etched with concern. Laura, what's going on? Mark called, his eyes darting between her and the chest. Laura tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush. She showed them the photos, the letter, the trinkets. Emily knelt beside her, her small hands sifting through the items with wide-eyed wonder. Grandma knew about Buddy, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. But just as they began to piece together the mystery, the wind picked up, and a strange sound filled the air. It was a low, mournful howl, one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Buddy stood, his fur bristling, and barked fiercely, as if challenging whatever was out there. Laura's heart raced as the howl grew louder, closer. The family huddled together, unsure of what was coming. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The woods fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Buddy turned to Laura, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He barked once, then ran toward the edge of the clearing. Laura hesitated, but the pull to follow him was too strong to ignore. Mark and Emily followed, their fear outweighed by their trust in Buddy. They reached a small, hidden glade where a figure stood waiting. It was an elderly man, his face lined with age but his eyes sharp and kind. He held something in his hands, a small box that he extended toward Laura. This, he said, his voice steady, is the final piece of the puzzle. Your mother entrusted it to me, knowing one day you would find your way here. Laura opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a simple pendant, the same symbol from the stone marker engraved on it. The moment she touched it, a warmth spread through her, and a flood of memories surfaced: her mother's laughter, her wisdom, and her unwavering belief in the strength of their family. The man nodded, as if satisfied. Buddy's journey with you isn't over, but his purpose is clear. He came to remind you of who you are and to guide you through the darkness. As the family stood in the glade, the weight of their grief began to lift. Buddy wagged his tail, his mission far from complete but his impact undeniable. They returned home together, the pendant a constant reminder of the love that had guided them and would continue to guide them through even the darkest times. But as Laura placed the pendant on her nightstand that night, she noticed something strange. The intricate loops on the pendant seemed to glow faintly in the dark, pulsing like a heartbeat. Buddy watched from his spot at the foot of the bed, his eyes gleaming with a knowing light. The journey, it seemed, was only just beginning. As the soft glow from the pendant faded into the quiet of the night, Laura lay awake, her thoughts a swirl of emotions and revelations. Buddy was curled up at her feet, his steady breaths grounding her in the present. The events of the past day felt surreal, yet every detail was etched into her mind: the key, the chest, the letter, the pendant, and the mysterious man who seemed to have been waiting for her arrival. Morning brought a new kind of calm, one that Laura hadn't felt in years. As sunlight streamed through the windows, the pendant glinted on her nightstand, catching her attention. It no longer pulsed with that mysterious glow, but its presence alone felt like a quiet reassurance, a reminder of her mother's guidance and love. Mark and Emily joined her in the kitchen, their expressions lighter, their voices softer. The weight that had hung over their family for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Over breakfast, they pored over the contents of the chest, piecing together fragments of the past and uncovering stories that had been hidden in time. "Grandma really thought of everything," Emily said, holding up a small, worn notebook filled with handwritten notes and sketches. It detailed plans, thoughts, and dreams that her mother had never shared aloud but had preserved for them to discover. Each page felt like a conversation with her, as if she were still there, guiding them through her words. Mark reached for a photograph that had been tucked into the notebook. "She wanted us to remember," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just her, but who we are as a family. What we've overcome. What we still have." Buddy wagged his tail as if to agree, his presence a steady reminder of the connection that had brought them to this moment. Laura couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. Buddy wasn't just a dog, he was a bridge between their past and present, a living symbol of hope and resilience. Over the following days, life began to take on a new rhythm. The chest and its contents became a source of inspiration, sparking conversations and projects that brought the family closer. Emily used the stories and photos to create a scrapbook, pouring her creativity into preserving their history in a way that felt tangible and alive. Mark found himself drawn to the old letters, reading them aloud in the evenings as they sat together by the fireplace. For Laura, the pendant became a part of her daily life. She wore it close to her heart, finding comfort in its presence. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of everything her mother had stood for: love, strength, and the unwavering belief in their family's bond. But even as they settled into this new sense of normalcy, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. The man in the woods, the glowing pendant, the key that had led them to the chest, each piece felt like part of a larger puzzle. And Buddy's watchful eyes seemed to echo her thoughts, his unwavering attention suggesting that their journey wasn't entirely over. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Laura decided to share her thoughts. "I feel like there's still something we're missing," she said, holding the pendant between her fingers. "Something we're meant to find or understand." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible. Your mom wouldn't have gone through all this trouble if it was just about leaving memories behind. She always had a bigger picture in mind." Emily's eyes lit up. "Maybe Buddy knows. He's been the one leading us this whole time." They all turned to Buddy, who was lying by the fireplace but perked up at the mention of his name. His tail wagged, and he barked softly, as if to say, "You're on the right track." The next morning, Buddy led them back into the woods. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden beams. They followed him to the stone marker where it had all begun. Laura felt a familiar shiver as she knelt before it, the loops etched into the surface seeming to shimmer faintly in the morning light. This time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint carving near the base of the marker, almost hidden by moss. She brushed it away, revealing a series of symbols and letters that matched the design on the pendant. "It's a message," she whispered, tracing the lines with her fingers. Mark crouched beside her, studying the carving. "It looks like coordinates," he said, pulling out his phone to check. "They're not far from here." Excitement and curiosity propelled them forward, Buddy leading the way as they navigated deeper into the woods. The coordinates brought them to another clearing, smaller than the first but filled with a sense of quiet significance. In the center stood a simple wooden bench, weathered by time but sturdy. On the bench sat a small, intricately carved box, its lid engraved with the same looping design. Laura approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. When she opened it, she found a single envelope inside, addressed to her. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. "My dearest Laura, if you've found this, then you've completed the journey I hoped you would take. This was never just about me, it was about you, about our family, and about the strength you carry within you. Life will always bring challenges, but you are never alone. Buddy is your guardian, but so are the memories, the love, and the resilience that have been passed down to you. Trust in yourself, Laura. You have everything you need to face whatever comes next. Love always, Mom." Tears streamed down Laura's face as she finished reading. She felt an overwhelming sense of closure and peace, a feeling that they had come full circle. Mark and Emily stood beside her, their hands on her shoulders, sharing in the moment. Buddy barked softly, his tail wagging as if to say, "You've done it. You're ready now." The family lingered in the clearing, soaking in the sense of connection and understanding that had brought them together.